You know, it's funny how we treat human biology like it's a factory assembly line. Like, think about it.
Hmm.
If you buy a toaster and it doesn't toast bread, it's broken.
Right, it goes straight in the trash.
Exactly. It
Mhm.
deviated from the factory standard, so it's defective. And we have this deep-seated expectation that there's a standard, a baseline, a factory setting for what a human being should be.
A gold standard of normalcy.
Yeah. But what if that factory setting is like entirely made up? Today, our mission is to completely dismantle and reconstruct how you think about mental health normalcy and what it actually means to be a highly functioning human being.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. We're doing a deep dive into an incredibly thought-provoking excerpt from a text called The Spectrum of Human Capacity, and it's subtitled Beyond the Mythology of Normalcy.
Yeah, in that text, it really asks us to step back and examine the water we're swimming in. The foundational premise here, and we need to establish this right away, is that normal is not a biological fact.
It's a cultural construction.
Exactly. It's a cultural construction. And, like any cultural construction, it was built by someone to serve a very specific purpose.
Right.
We tend to visualize normalcy as the dead center of a bell curve of health. But the author argues there is no fixed point of human capacity from which all deviation can be measured as a deficiency.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to grasp why normal is a myth, we have to start by completely redefining a word we use constantly.
The word being disability.
Yes, disability. Usually when we hear that word, we immediately picture a personal deficit, right? Like a broken part.
Yeah, an individual failing. But the text looks at it through a totally different lens, an ecological lens.
Which makes so much more sense when you really think about it.
It does. In its truest sense, the text argues disability is simply a mismatch between a being's traits and the demands of their environment.
And there are some great examples in the source material for this.
Yeah, the author uses incredibly clear examples like a fish isn't disabled because it can't climb a tree, and a bat isn't impaired just because it navigates in the dark instead of the daylight.
Right, the fish is perfectly adapted for the water. The bat is optimized for the night sky.
Exactly. So disability is relational. It's the friction between a capacity and a context.
Relational, I love that word for this. It's not an intrinsic deficiency in the organism itself.
That's the crux of it. If an environment is rigid, hostile, or just, poorly designed if it was built exclusively to cater to a very narrow set of traits, then the disability actually resides in the environment.
Not in the person who's trying to navigate it.
Precisely.
You know, I was thinking about this, and the best way I can visualize that friction is like a smartphone.
Oh, yeah. How so?
So imagine you download a new app, but it's just terribly coded. It's constantly running in the background. It's pulling location data every 2 seconds, and it absolutely drains your smartphone's battery in an hour.
Oh, I've definitely had apps like that.
Right. Your phone gets blazing hot, the screen freezes, and the whole system just crashes. Now, is the smartphone broken? Is the physical hardware defective?
No, the phone is perfectly fine.
Exactly. The environment, in this case the poorly coded app, is demanding something the hardware was simply not meant to do.
That's a great analogy. And taking that smartphone analogy a step further, think about what happens when you try to force that hardware to comply anyway.
The system degrades. It burns out.
Right. And when we apply that to human beings, the implications are staggering.
I'd ask you, the listener, to pause and reflect on this for a second.
Yeah, really think about this.
Think about a time in your life when you felt completely unqualified or incapable, or like you were just failing at a basic task. Was the problem actually you?
Or were you operating in a rigid environment that just wasn't built for your specific traits?
Exactly.
So if disability is just environmental friction, like we're saying, then that begs a pretty massive question.
What's the baseline? Yeah. What exactly is the normal or neurotypical baseline that our modern environment is designed for? Like, if we're all smartphones, what's the operating system that society is optimizing for?
Well, the text introduces a concept here called normative dissociation, and this is one of its most provocative critiques.
Normative dissociation.
Yeah. We assume that because certain traits are statistically common, they must be biologically optimal. But the author draws a hard line here. Statistical frequency is not functional superiority.
Just because a lot of people can tolerate something doesn't mean it's like the healthiest way to live.
Exactly.
Wait, so the text is saying that putting up with things like sitting in a fluorescent lit office and ignoring our body's need to move isn't resilience.
Yeah.
It's actually dissociation.
The text calls it conditioned override. It points out that sitting under artificial lights for 8 hours a day, doing highly repetitive cognitive tasks, and actively ignoring your own physical and emotional signals.
Like ignoring the fact that you're tired or stressed or desperately need to stretch?
Right. Ignoring all of that is not a sign of a superior, robust organism. It is the learned silencing of our natural human intelligence.
Wow.
So what we call neurotypical might just be a population-level adaptation to a highly stressful environment.
Wait, I mean, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Doesn't society kind of need people to push through boring tasks?
Sure.
Like someone has to do the data entry, someone has to file the taxes, keep the supply chains moving. Isn't this conditioned override just another term for discipline? Isn't that just being a responsible adult in a functioning society?
Well, it's a fair question, and we really need to clarify what the text is claiming here. The author isn't stating that discipline is inherently bad,
Right.
or that society doesn't require routine maintenance to function. Rather, it's examining the origins of our diagnostic frameworks, which emerged from a heavily economic post-industrial context.
Okay, so it's tied to industrialization.
Exactly. The text maintains that what we consider the gold standard of mental functioning is actually just an economic preference.
An economic preference. Because a highly industrialized system needs compliant workers to function smoothly.
Right, so it praises compliance as health.
Yeah.
The argument is that we've confused an institution's preference for an easy-to-manage worker with nature's preference for a fully alive human being.
Ah, so it's about the value judgment we place on it.
Yes.
We've culturally decided that the person who can stare at a spreadsheet for 10 hours without having an emotional breakdown is the pinnacle of biological health, when really they're just the most economically convenient.
And, you know, the text remains strictly neutral on whether industrial capitalism itself is good or bad. It's just observing the dynamic.
Right, it's not taking a political stance.
No, it just insists we have to stop pretending that economic utility is the exact same thing as biological health. Because when we conflate those two things, we start pathologizing anyone whose nervous system refuses to comply with that specific mold.
And if society is demanding this conditioned override, then our doctors aren't actually diagnosing sickness, are they?
According to the text, no.
They're just diagnosing people who refuse to override their own needs.
I mean, let's walk through how the text redefines some of these common diagnoses, because this completely flips the script. Take ADHD, for example.
Yeah, with ADHD, the text argues that in many presentations, you aren't looking at a broken brain. You're looking at a nervous system that is highly responsive to novelty and heavily driven by meaning rather than obligation.
Okay, but how does that actually work mechanically, though? Because usually ADHD is just described as, like, an inability to focus.
Well, it's less about an inability to focus and more about how the brain allocates its attention based on its environment.
Oh, interesting.
The ADHD brain often requires genuine engagement, high stakes, or intense interest to release the dopamine required for sustained attention.
So when you place that brain in a modern classroom or cubicle that relies on artificial deadlines and repetitive, unstimulating tasks.
It struggles. It's a brain that simply refuses to pretend that meaningless tasks matter. But put that same nervous system in a high-stakes, fast-paced environment, like an emergency room or a complex creative crisis.
And suddenly, that deficit translates into intense hyperfocus and rapid problem solving.
It's incredible. And the text is something very similar with autism spectrum presentations.
It does.
We usually hear about autism in terms of social deficits, but the source frames it around profound capacities, right? Like deep pattern recognition and intense sensory awareness.
Yes, and it explains why those traits become a crisis in the modern world.
How so?
Well, the autistic brain often likes the automatic neurological filters that allow most people to tune out background noise, fluorescent lights, or overlapping conversations.
Which sounds overwhelming.
In a modern office, yes. But in nature, taking in absolutely every piece of sensory data is an extraordinary capacity. You notice everything.
Right.
But when you drop that unfiltered sensory awareness into an open-plan office or a crowded shopping mall, the environment becomes actively hostile. The brain is overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data it's being forced to process.
So the breakdown isn't the autism itself. It's the fact that modern environments are sensory nightmares built without those individuals in mind.
Exactly. And that environmental lens is also applied to borderline personality disorder, which the text notes is predominantly diagnosed in women.
Yeah, and the source describes BPD as intense emotional sensitivity and relational attunement that has been severely disrupted.
The text argues that when you look closely at the history of someone diagnosed with BPD, it almost always correlates with a history of trauma, chronic emotional invalidation, and a severe lack of early support.
So the intense fear of abandonment and the rapid emotional shifts aren't just random chemical misfires.
No, they're survival mechanisms.
They're highly logical physiological responses to being hurt in environments that weren't safe.
Yeah.
We're pathologizing the aftermath of harm rather than seeing it as a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do to survive.
And the discussion on depression and anxiety follows that exact same thread. I mean, we're currently seeing epidemic levels of both.
Oh, absolutely.
The source criticizes the mainstream medical tendency to treat these purely as chemical irregularities isolated within the individual's brain. Instead, it suggests they are entirely logical responses to genuinely depressing and anxiety-inducing conditions in the modern world.
Conditions like widespread social isolation, precarious housing, meaningless labor.
And a totally severed connection to nature.
Yeah.
When human beings are isolated from their communities and divorced from the natural world, their bodies sound an alarm. Depression and anxiety are often the body's way of signaling that the environment is fundamentally unlivable.
Going back to our tech analogy earlier, it's like trying to run high-end, highly sensitive video editing software on a computer that society has forced to only run basic, repetitive spreadsheet programs.
Right.
The computer crashes, and society blames the hardware, completely ignoring the fact that it's forcing the wrong software. But what about the other side of the coin?
What do you mean?
Well, because if we're constantly diagnosing the people who don't fit the corporate mold, what about the people who do fit perfectly?
That's where the system's inherent bias becomes glaringly obvious. The text points out that there are severe functional impairments that almost never get diagnosed simply because they are useful to hierarchical institutions.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The dark triad traits.
Yes. The text lists specific behaviors. The capacity to cause immense harm to others while remaining completely emotionally untroubled.
Wow.
The ability to follow orders blindly without ever questioning the ethical implications of those orders. The comfort with treating other human beings as disposable tools rather than living creatures.
And the profound inability to sit with grief, mystery, or uncertainty.
Right.
These traits are not in the diagnostic manual as disorders. In fact, they're exactly what gets you promoted.
They're rewarded.
Think about it. The emotionally suppressed executive who feels absolutely nothing when they fire 50 people to boost quarterly profits. We call them professional.
Yeah.
The person who lacks empathy and treats humans like cogs in a machine to maximize efficiency, we call them a decisive leader.
The science of diagnosis has been built around a pre-existing, heavily biased decision about what kind of human being is considered valuable.
It's the canary in the coal mine analogy, right?
Yeah.
We're essentially diagnosing the canary with a breathing disorder instead of addressing the toxic air in the mine.
Exactly. If a trait helps an institution extract value, it is considered a sign of health, no matter how much relational or ecological damage that trait causes.
But biologically, this just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, evolution is incredibly ruthless. It weeds out inefficiencies over time.
It does.
So if being distractible or highly sensitive or emotionally volatile is so detrimental to functioning, why are these traits still so prevalent in the human gene pool?
The answer the text provides is that evolution does not produce monocultures. A diverse population is a resilient population.
Right.
To understand why these traits exist, we have to look at the context of our evolutionary history. Specifically, small pre-industrial communities deeply embedded in nature.
Where these traits were needed.
In that context, these diverse traits weren't just tolerated. They were absolutely vital for the collective survival of the group.
The text does this beautiful translation of how modern clinical terms would have been viewed in the past.
It's a great section.
It explains that what we now pathologize as being overly sensitive would have been recognized in a natural setting as deep perception.
Yes.
It's the person in the group who notices the subtle drop in barometric pressure before a storm hits, or senses the unspoken tension in the community before it erupts into violence.
And what the modern classroom clinicalizes as being distractible, the inability to focus on one boring task for hours.
Right.
A hunter-gatherer community would recognize that as peripheral awareness. Being attentive to everything in your environment is a crucial survival skill when you need to be aware of approaching predators or rapidly changing environmental cues.
A brain that locks onto one task and ignores its surroundings would actually be a liability in the wild.
It would get you killed.
My favorite translation in the text is how it frames being emotionally dysregulated.
Ooh, yes.
In a modern office, if you show intense emotion, you're a liability. But the text says that in a traditional community, that intense emotional capacity would be recognized as sacred rage or necessary communal grief.
It was a call to collective attention.
Right. The person feeling it wasn't broken. They were doing the emotional heavy lifting for the entire village. They were the one pointing out that something was wrong and needed to be addressed.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the fundamental distinction becomes very clear. Institutions prefer traits that make people easy to manage. Nature prefers traits that make people fully alive.
I love that.
These varied cognitive styles and emotional capacities were never problems before the modern world decided they were. They only became problems the exact moment human beings were required to function like standardized, interchangeable components in an industrial machine.
And the system simply diagnosed the components that resisted the standardization.
Exactly.
It's a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Makes you realize how incredibly brittle a society is when it only values one highly specific type of mind.
Think about agriculture.
Right, in agriculture, if you plant a monoculture like only one single type of crop, one specific disease can sweep through and wipe out the entire field because there's no genetic defense.
But a highly diverse, tangled ecosystem can survive almost any shock.
Yeah.
The presence of deep feelers, visionary thinkers, introverts, and highly sensitive people is not a problem that needs to be medicated away. It is a feature of the human ecosystem. It is exactly how the human species survives complexity and adapts to change.
As we come to the end of this deep dive, we hit what the text calls the reckoning. And the aha moment here for you listening is really crucial to grasp.
Because the goal of everything we've just discussed isn't to just flip the hierarchy upside down.
Right. The goal isn't to start handing out clinical diagnoses to the neurotypical, or to suddenly declare that being a compliant, routine-oriented worker is a disease.
The reckoning is much deeper than that. The text urges us to drop the entire framework of normal versus pathological altogether when we are talking about the natural spectrum of human variation.
It's about changing the question entirely.
Exactly. We need to stop looking at different minds and asking, what is wrong with this person? And start asking, what specific environmental conditions would allow this particular being to fully develop their unique form of intelligence?
It's about building a world that can actually hold and support the full spectrum of humanity, rather than just selecting for the tiny fragment of it that happens to be the easiest to exploit for profit.
And for you, as the listener, this has profound and very practical applications in your daily life. It invites you to conduct an audit of your own environments.
Such a good exercise.
Are you constantly feeling disabled by your workplace, the structure of your social circles, or the rigid demands of your daily routines?
Yeah, and if so, the source material urges you to stop internalizing that friction as a personal failure.
Instead, consider, what environments actually bring out your deepest capacities? Where do you feel like the fish in the water rather than the fish exhausting itself trying to climb the tree?
So what does this all mean? Ultimately, it means that the incredible, messy, beautiful diversity of human minds isn't a glitch in the system. It is our greatest inheritance.
You are not a standardized product, and you were never meant to be.
Exactly. If you've been rotting away, feeling broken because you can't seem to survive in the water, maybe it's time to stop diagnosing yourself as defective and start looking for the desert where you were actually meant to bloom.
Well said.
I want to leave you with one final, lingering question to ponder on your own today. If our modern society is currently only designed to reward a tiny, highly compliant fraction of human capacity, what completely different, world-changing types of human genius are lying dormant inside you right now, just waiting for the right kind of world to wake them up?